February 11th, 1958. Ithaca, New York. A small commuter plane sits on the runway, propellers already turning over in the cold. Inside, a 26-year-old former nurse named Ruth Carol Taylor checks her uniform one more time. Not because she's nervous about the flight. She's flown before, just never like this. Never in front. Taylor isn't a model. She isn't an actress. She's a registered nurse from the Bellevue School of Nursing who got tired of being told no. TWA rejected her application outright, so she filed a discrimination complaint with the New York State Commission and kept applying anywhere that would have her. Out of 800 black applicants, Mohawk Airlines, a small regional carrier, picked exactly one. Her. In a few minutes, this short hop from Ithaca to New York City will make her the first black flight attendant in American history. Not the first to fight for the job, the first to actually fly it. But here's what almost nobody knows when they tell this story. Ruth Carol Taylor's career in the sky lasted exactly 6 months. Not because she failed, because she got married, and getting married was against the rules. That gap, between what it took to get into that uniform and what it took to keep it, runs through almost every part of this story. Today, we're counting down 10 unspoken rules every black flight attendant followed in the golden age of flying. The rules written into law, the rules airlines chose for themselves without anyone forcing them to, and the rules nobody put on paper at all. But every woman in that uniform understood anyway. Some of these rules applied to every stewardess in America. Some applied only to the black ones. By the end, you'll understand exactly which was which, and why only one of those 3 categories ever really changed. Number 10. The 800. Before Ruth Carol Taylor ever boarded that plane, she had to get past the door. Picture the envelope first. A typed application, a photograph clipped to the corner because every airline wanted to see your face before it read a word about your nursing license or your references. A 3-cent stamp, a mailbox, then the waiting. Mohawk Airlines announced it was interested in hiring a black stewardess, and 800 of those envelopes came back. 800 photographs clipped to 800 corners. 800 women who'd filled out the same form, licked the same stamp, and mailed it toward the same single opening. This wasn't unusual for the era. Stewardess jobs were genuinely glamorous work, one of the only careers that let a young woman travel, earn her own income and see the country, at a time when most of her options were teaching, nursing, or factory work. But for black applicants, the math was different. White applicants were competing against hundreds of others for dozens of open positions across a dozen airlines. Black applicants were competing against hundreds of others for one. Most major carriers, American, Delta, Eastern, United, simply didn't hire black stewardesses at all in 1957. Not as a written rule. As a practice so consistent, it didn't need to be written down. Mohawk was the exception, and even Mohawk was only filling one seat. Number 9. The tape measure. Before race ever entered the room, every stewardess applicant, black or white, met the tape measure first. Airlines in this era ran on physical specification sheets as rigid as any military enlistment standard. Chicago and Southern Airlines' 1954 qualification sheet asked for a height between 5'2" and 5'5", a weight between 100 and 120 pounds, slender legs, a good figure, clear skin, and the line that mattered most for what came next, natural colored hair. Every airline ran its own version of this checklist. Pan Am wanted cosmopolitan elegance. United wanted a wholesome girl next door. Delta, proud of its southern roots, advertised that its stewardesses came from home and heritage, a phrase that meant exactly what it sounds like it meant. Weigh-ins were regular and mandatory. Girdles were required on duty. Mandatory retirement at 32. This was the cage every stewardess in America flew inside, white or black. But for black applicants, this same checklist did something else entirely. Natural colored hair and clear skin weren't neutral standards applied evenly. They were a second, unspoken filter, one that would decide not just whether a black woman got hired, but which black woman. Number 8. Who got chosen by the early 1960s? A small number of black stewardesses had broken through at major carriers, and journalists who studied their photographs noticed something the airlines never said in writing. Almost every one of them had a lighter complexion and straighter hair than the broader black population they were supposedly opening the door for. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a coincidence, repeated airline after airline. It was the same unwritten beauty standard from the rule before this one, applied with extra weight when race entered the equation. An airline could tell itself, and tell the public, that it had integrated. It could do that while still selecting for exactly the kind of black woman who came closest to its existing, white-coded definition of attractive. And even then, airlines were careful about where her image appeared. Several carriers ran advertisements featuring their black stewardesses exclusively in Ebony magazine, never in mainstream publications, never where a white customer base might see them first. Visible enough to claim progress, contained enough to manage it. Number 7. 4 years in a file cabinet. In 1956, a young woman named Patricia Banks walked away from an interview with Capital Airlines having been told plainly by a chief stewardess the company did not hire Negroes in flight capacities. Banks didn't let it end there. On the advice of Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr., she filed a 72-page complaint with the New York State Commission Against Discrimination. Capital Airlines' legal defense wasn't that it hadn't discriminated. It was that Banks had supposedly missed a filing deadline, a technicality raised by lawyers to avoid answering the actual complaint. It took 4 years. 4 years of Patricia Banks's life, while the file moved through hearings and appeals, before the commission finally ruled in her favor in February of 1960, and didn't just order Capital Airlines to hire her. It ordered the airline to stop barring Negroes from any flight position, stewardess included, altogether. Number 6. What winning cost her? Patricia Banks won, and then the letters started arriving. Threats. Threats to her safety. Threats serious enough that local police began keeping track of her flight schedule, just in case. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the headline. In 1960, a black woman didn't just have to win a legal case to get a job behind a beverage cart. She had to be willing to survive being known for it. She took the job anyway. In May of 1960, 4 years after she'd first applied, Patricia Banks became the first black stewardess at a southern-based commercial carrier in the United States. So far, every rule we've covered was written somewhere, on a hiring sheet, in a court filing, on a measuring tape. Rules with paper trails. Rules you could, in theory, fight in front of a commission, the way Patricia Banks did. What's coming in the second half is different. These are the rules nobody filed a complaint about, because nobody wrote them down anywhere to complain about. The rule about how a black stewardess had to carry herself in the galley. The rule about which cities she'd rather not lay over in. The rule about what one bad shift could cost the next woman in line behind her. Before we get there, if a story like this is new to you, the subscribe button is right there, and hitting it means you won't miss where we're going next, because the next rule on this list might be the one that explains all the others. Number 5. The marriage bar. Ruth Carol Taylor's flying career ended after 6 months. Not a performance issue, not a complaint. She got married. Nearly every airline in America enforced what's now called the marriage bar. A stewardess had to be single, and if she married, she resigned, or was let go. The same rule applied to pregnancy. It wasn't framed as punishment, it was framed as simple fact. Airlines saw stewardesses as a transitional role, something a young woman did before her real life as a wife began, not a career a woman could keep. This rule applied to every stewardess regardless of race. United's official 1968 qualifications still listed it in plain language. Must be unmarried, no children. It would take until the late 1960s for airlines to begin relaxing it at all, and into the 1980s before it disappeared completely. But notice what this means for someone like Taylor. She broke a barrier that took 800 applicants and a discrimination complaint to crack open. And the same institution that finally let her in still considered her marriage a fireable offence, the same as it would for anyone else. The achievement and the erasure ran on completely separate clocks. Number 4. The Southern Layover. Winning the legal right to fly didn't win the legal right to rest. When black stewardesses began working southern routes in the early 1960s, they discovered that federal aviation rules said nothing about where a flight crew slept between shifts, and in the segregated South, that silence had consequences. Black stewardesses on overnight layovers were routed to separate, segregated hotels from their white crewmates, sometimes arranged quietly by the airline itself, rather than left to chance. No federal law required an airline to do this. No airline had to. Somewhere in an office far from any cockpit, someone made a phone call, booked 2 blocks of rooms instead of 1, and never wrote down why. Number 3. The boycott nobody wanted to need. By the mid-1960s, progress had stalled badly enough that one of the most respected organizations in the civil rights movement got involved directly. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a boycott against Delta Airlines over its consistently low numbers of black employees, stewardesses included. This is worth sitting with. Patricia Banks had already won her case. Ruth Carol Taylor had already flown. The legal door had already been opened in 1960. And by 1965, a year after the Civil Rights Act made discriminatory hiring a federal offense, black stewardesses still numbered only around 50. In an industry employing more than 15,000, the math hadn't really moved. A winnable case was never the same thing as a changed industry. That gap is exactly what an organization built for sustained pressure, not a single lawsuit. was built to close. Number 2. One bad day. Here's the rule nobody at any airline ever said out loud, and every black stewardess understood instantly. She didn't get to have an off day. Not really. A white stewardess who showed up tired, or short with a passenger, or slightly out of uniform, was one employee having a bad shift. A black stewardess doing the exact same thing risked becoming the reason her airline decided the experiment hadn't worked, and the reason the next qualified black woman in line never got her interview at all. This is the same unspoken weight Patricia Banks carried into Capital Airlines in 1960, and by her own account, it's part of why she resigned after just 1 year. Not because she'd failed, but because the pressure of being the only one, and the fear of what one mistake could cost everyone coming after her, never let up. We're holding back one more story for the very end of this list, the one piece of this rule that, when you hear it, recontextualizes almost everything else we've covered today. Number 1. 6 months. We end where we began. Ruth Carol Taylor's career as a flight attendant lasted exactly 6 months, February to August 1958. She wasn't fired for poor performance. She wasn't pushed out by complaints from passengers or crew. She got married, and the marriage bar did the rest. The same rule that applied to every stewardess in the country, black or white, regardless of the 800 applicants she'd beaten to get there in the first place. Here's the detail that rarely makes it into the telling, and the one we held back. By Taylor's own account, decades later, she never actually wanted a long career as a stewardess in the first place. She took the job to break the barrier, not to keep it. In a 1995 interview, she said it plainly. Being told people of color couldn't even apply was the thing that set her teeth on edge, not any particular love of the job itself. Sit with what that means against everything in the rule before this one. Every black stewardess after Taylor carried the unspoken weight of knowing one bad day could close the door behind her. Taylor never had to carry that weight for long. 6 months isn't enough time for the pressure to fully set in. The women who paid the real cost of one bad day were the ones who came after her and stayed. Patricia Banks, a full year at Capital Airlines by her own account, never able to exhale. Taylor opened the door, the cost of walking through it and landing on someone else. She didn't get to stay, but she didn't need to. 3 months after her flight, TWA hired Margaret Grant. By 1965, around 50 black women wore the uniform. By the early 1970s, that number had climbed past 900. The 6 months Ruth Carol Taylor actually spent in the sky were never really the point. The 800 women who applied alongside her, and the 1,000 who came after, that was the point all along. So look back at all 10, and a pattern sorts itself out into 3 distinct categories, and they didn't all move at the same speed. The first category was law. Patricia Banks's case was decided by a state commission. The marriage bar was eventually undone by federal pressure and lawsuits of its own. Law is slow to change, but once it changes for everyone, all at once, on paper, whether an individual airline likes it or not. The second category was institutional choice. Segregated layover hotels. Which magazine ran her photograph? Which complexion got the interview? None of this was ever required by any law. It was simply what airlines chose to keep doing, quietly, for as long as nobody made them stop. Which is exactly why it took an organized boycott, not a single court case, to start moving it. And the third category was entirely unwritten. The pressure of being first. The cost of one bad day. Nobody at any airline wrote that rule down, because nobody needed to. Every black woman who put on that uniform understood it the moment she walked into the terminal, and that's exactly the kind of rule that doesn't show up in a court filing or a personnel policy, and doesn't disappear just because the law finally changed. 3 categories, 3 different timelines. Only one of them, the law, was ever fully within anyone's power to force open from the outside. Ruth Carol Taylor stood on that tarmac in February of 1958 for exactly 6 months of flying and a lifetime of consequence. The gap between what it took to get into that uniform and what it took to keep it, that's the story of nearly everyone on this list. Not just Taylor. Patricia Banks, 4 years in a file cabinet before she ever boarded a plane. The 800 women who applied and never got a seat at all. The law eventually caught up. The unwritten rules took much longer. Some would say they never fully left. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the next video in this series is already on the way. 10 unspoken rules every black domestic worker followed, and the story of a woman who organized a movement from the back of a city bus. Subscribe so you don't miss it.